Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And many thanks to our hosts and hostesses. I will name them all. I will not name them all again. And I'll try to show why these textiles were a status symbol. And you have to bear with me to go through the work of a merchant, of a silk and gold merchant, in order to understand what they were, how they were made, because we haven't seen the like in the last 3 centuries. And just to make it clear, nobody today can make them. So we will just quickly go through this enormous job. In the 15th centuries, the cities that produced important silk textiles were in central and northern Italy, Venice, Genoa, Florence mainly, and in southern Spain. None of the prime materials were in those areas except for silk in southern Spain. So what a merchant, the silk and gold merchant, had to do, the first thing was to get the silk. And Genoa, Florence, mainly Genoa and Milan, got the silk from southern Spain. It would come by ship, Genoese ships, because, as you all know, Genoa was under the political government of the Duchy of Milan. Once the raw silk arrived, it was given to different workshops, but also to private homes in the countryside, where women mainly worked at spinning, twisting, throwing, and getting to the thread. When the merchant got his thread, he had to buy the dye, the coloring stuff. He bought it himself. The most expensive coloring was red, followed by blue. And for red, there were different qualities. We won't go very much into it, but crimson or kermesse was so good that the silks today look the way you see them. And then grain, and until 2009, we couldn't tell crimson, kermesse from grain. There was no way to tell the difference from analysis. Brazil wood is a vegetable, and so is madder, which is less expensive by far. Now, kermesse and grain come from a small cochineal, and we were finally ready to understand a document that was known, but as it often happens, documents mean nothing if they're not connected with an object, above all in textiles. So we found out from Giacomo Badoer, a Venetian who lived in Constantinople from 1436 to 1440. He was there to buy kermesse and slaves and iron, and he would pay for them with textiles, mainly, so it was bartending. And we figured out, it's a long story, but we have to go quickly, that the small menudo Cornese was Polish cochineal, by far the most expensive, and second was the Armenian cochineal, or Ararat. It was called grain always because it looked like grains. The dried insect looked like small grains. Now, the Polish cochineal would come from Poland, Ukraine, and Russia to Tana on the Black Sea, and there Venetian and Genoese ships would pick it up, pay for it, and take it to either Venice or Genoa. It was so expensive, the Polish cochineal, and it took a lot more of it because they were very small grains, that the price of the finished textiles depended on the red dye. And that's why the selvage was there to declare where the textile was woven and which kind of red coloring stuff had been used. And since the selvage was so important, it was almost always counterfeited. So when we study the textiles, we cannot, it's already hard enough to make the analysis, but once we made the analysis, we find out that very often the selvage is counterfeited, and documents confirm it. This is a very nice image from one of the early publications of Marco Polo's stories, and you can see that from the headpieces, that those who bring cochineal, kermesse, and in the other big bag is alum, which is necessary as a mordant, are Middle Easterners. And what they bring back to the ships are rolls of wool cloth. Europe exported wool cloth, not dyed, because they had very good dyers in the Middle East, and they would bring in kermesse, also grain. And aluminum was present in Sardinia and in Croatia, but the best was from Syria. So that had to be imported too. So our merchant would give this coloring stuff, and for blue it was either woad, which grew all over the world. It's a very sturdy plant. But better still for silk was indigo, and that came from India and what is today Iran or Pakistan. Woad, as I said, grew all over. We have to go faster. But the best woad, and this is important, was cultivated in Lombardy. And Lombard woad would go to all over Europe and be exported mainly to the north, although Germany, France, and England had very extensive cultivation of woad, but it was not as good. You can see already from this very fast trip how there were many qualities in every component and how important it was to have the best for the best of textiles. So indigo, here it is, was brought in from the Far East. Then the merchant, when he got his thread back, dyed from the dyers, had to buy the metal threads. Could be gold filet that you see at the right, on the right side, or looped, the boucle thread. Now, how was that made and by whom? The gold beater would beat the nugget into a small square, about 20 centimeter by 20, very, very thin, between 1 and 3 microns, and put them inside a little book. And this book was given to a group of women who often worked at home, because they didn't need to have a large workshop. They didn't belong to a guild, so they could be paid less than men who belonged to guilds. And also because they, as I often say, they had more patience than men, and they had small hands. Now, a woman would take this leaf, transparent leaf, and believe it or not, cut it into strips. There are between 8 and 15 microns wide, thick, and between 150 and 370 microns wide. And what's interesting about Milanese strips, and that's how we recognize them, is that if we measure them in different points, they all have the same width and the same thickness. So these women had very sharp eye and steady hand. So we wonder if they were taught or if they were chosen because they had this skill. This would be important to understand when we talk about today, because we're trying to have all of these things revived within today's market possibilities. So here you see the strip, and you see a SEM image of the strip so you can realize what it was. Then the strip was given to a woman on the other side of the table because it couldn't be moved very much, and she would be a spinner. She would have a spindle and simply wound it around a silk core if it was for a silk textile. It was forbidden to have a cotton or linen core in a silk textile. And the core could be raw color or whitened or dyed, and it has different looks. We'll skip over this. It's just to show you how we work on these things. At this point, the merchant would have his gold thread and his dyed silk thread. He has to go to somebody who's making a drawing. Now, we have beautiful drawings by great artists like this one at the Louvre, but we have to keep in mind that Bellini could have drawn this so it would become a textile, but also he could have drawn this copying from a textile because it was going to put in a painting. We do not have documentation for payments to Bellini or other known artists for drawings for textiles, but we do have payments to other artists who are not known for any important work. The drawing had to be given to another specialist who would translate it into a point paper. Every square of this paper is the meeting of the warp with the weft and has a color, and that color tells the weaver if the warp will go on top or below the weft. Now, weavers were great mathematicians, and it's quite obvious that the hand loom for velvets was a form of computer. It worked on the two bases. We won't go into it, but everybody seems to agree that that's what a loom was, and that's why it was a secret, and you couldn't move a loom from one city to another. They never wrote how looms were built, and we never found a 15th century loom because being so precious, they kept modernizing it. So we have looms that have parts of the 15th century, but not a single loom from the 15th century has come down to us. Finally, the merchant would give the paper point, the silk, and the gold to the weaver, a master weaver for velvet. He was already about 30, and he would have worked a few years before stopping, because he didn't get to weave this kind of velvets when they were young. This is a hand loom as it was reconstructed in the 18th century, and it does work on this type of textile. So you can see it's a very complicated machine. The weaver could weave about 1 centimeter a day, working from dawn to sunset of this kind of velvet. So it would be quite a few, and it took him about a month to set the loom for the new pattern. So it would take a couple of years to do about, the average was 6 arm length, so about 3 meters and 60 centimeters of a textile that had a width maximum of 60 centimeters. So the merchant finally got his bolt, and either had been commissioned by somebody locally, so he would turn it in to the local clients, or he would have to send them to the fairs. The green squares are the main fairs. So he would need insurance, and transportation was very dangerous. So you can tell from all this very brief story that the merchant needed to live in a city that was a center of a financial net, a banking net, a commercial net, and a place where all sorts of artisans could live and work. And that's why I named them again, Venice, Genova, Florence. They were such a city. And there you have it. I like this picture of banker Fugger a few years later, and he has Venice, Milan on his drawers, all the names of the Italian city. At this point, we are in 1442, and Filippo Maria Visconti, who is the Duke of Milan, decides that he wants to have such an industry, and that's the word they use, industry, in his city, in his state, because it is status symbol. But it is not just status symbol for those who own them, it is status symbol for those who produce them and for the state that produces them. Often merchants sold so many of these textiles to the prince, in this case to the Sforzas. The Sforza never paid for them. Sforzas never had any money. So sooner or later, the debt became very large, And the Duke gave them the option to collect taxes in certain areas or certain towns on wine, on flour, on salt, on woad. And they accepted, were happy to accept that. But after a while, that wasn't enough because the Duke kept buying silks, and we'll see the prices. And so they had to give them land and a title. So it was status symbol to produce it, to be a merchant, because eventually they became noblemen. Now, he died in 47, so he couldn't do very much. But after 3 years of turmoil, here comes this great condottiero, this great general, who was also a very fine diplomat, Francesco Sforza, who had saved the kingdom of Naples, who had worked for the Pope, and had been called to Milan by the Duke to save him from a riotous nobility. He was 40 years old, and he answered that he would come if the Duke would give his only daughter in marriage to him. It was an illegitimate daughter, but the only one he had. And so they were married. She was a little girl. He left her alone a few years and saved the Duke. In 47, it was a Milanese republic, a revolution. He left the city, and then he came back, sieged the city, and after many months, when the city was absolutely, people were starving, he entered as the conqueror. And here, I remember what Francesco said this morning about the prince being loved or feared. Instead of entering with his army, like all conquerors would have done, he entered with just 5 or 6 armed men, followed by 25 wagons full of bread. The people loved him and acclaimed him Duke. And this was his problem. And this was the problem of all the Sforzas, because they did not have the imperial diploma. It was chamber nobility, acclaimed by the people first and then by the local nobility, while the Visconti had been imperial nobility. And through their whole existence, Francesco, his eldest son, Galeazzo Maria, and then the last one, Ludovico, had this problem. And they used textiles a lot to give their messages. And now we're going to the messages. Yeah, we have some time. Oh, that's the reason why the Sforza could do this. They had Genova as a port and as a navy, and they had 3 big passes to the north, to Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. So obviously, they could have the seat of a great industry. Now, Francesco, at first, he never had money, but at first he really didn't have any money. He was very famous, he was a great man, but couldn't afford very much while he was married in 44, up to 47. At court, they called him the Count, which meant really, it was very low nobility. His father had been a condottiero, and he had a small title where he had, we'll see what we had. So I looked at this velvet for 20 years, and there are about 5 in the world. And I thought that funny, well, I don't know what, I should push this one. Oh, I thought it was ugly, it was out of place, it bothered me, but well. And then I went by Santa Maria delle Grazie one day, and you know, there are all the devices of the Sforzas that Bramante put there, of course, that Ludovico wanted there. And I saw the quince, the device of the quince, and I thought, oh, that's a quince. So that textile was made for Francesco when he was so poor that he couldn't afford to have a whole point paper made with his arms or whatever. And so he put in the quince. Was that possible? That's the device of the quince with the motto Fragranza Perdura, and this is important for what we're going to see. And yes, I I believe that this was one small device for a man who didn't have any money in those terrible years between 44 and 55. It took him 5 years to put things into place. By 55, he is a powerful duke. Everybody accepts him as a duke, and most of all, his wife was madly in love with him. Her letters to him are fantastic. And here you have a beautiful little booklet where Bianca Maria, who's the daughter of the Visconti and the wife of Francesco, puts inside the B, that is the first letter of her name, a device, which is a device Francesco invented. Now, the Sforzas use all the Visconti devices because they wanted to make sure everybody recognized the fact they inherited all that belonged to the Viscontis. But Francesco invented some, and Ludovico also. And this was invented by Francesco. It's the Sempervivum. It's a plant that can live without water, without light, in cold weather, in hot weather. It's indestructible. And that was what he chose to represent himself, but also the motto in German, mit Zeit, with time, to remind people he was not just a very strong warrior, he was also a diplomat. He could wait. He knew how to wait when it was the case to say things, not to say, to do things, and so forth. So Bianca took this as her favorite, which is interesting, as not a Visconti. Here it is. For some reason, scholars they call them artichokes. They call them all sorts of nasty vegetable names. And then they knew there was a Sempervivum device, but who knew what it was? And then I went by a florist shop, and I saw that, and I thought, that's a Sempervivum, so that's it, because scholars sometimes have to go in flower shops and so forth. And so that's the Sempervivum, and that she used with a different meaning. And this, here we come to their main concern. With time, out of two, there'll be a third, a son, who will be the lawful duke because he will be a Sforza, but also a Visconti. So she used it all the time. And we see it in this beautiful textile, which covers this treatise on falconry, dedicated, that belonged to Francesco, dated 1459, which is very special technically. And here we come to technology. It's not a samite and it's not tapestry weave. It's a hybrid. It's none of those. We never found the like anywhere else. But I found a document of belonging to the shop of Leonardo Lanteri, who was a mercer, who asked directly to Francesco Sforza, to the Duke, the permission to try a new special loom for passementerie, braids, tassels, and so forth. And that's the only loom that could weave this. So this connection shows how interested the Duke was in having very special textiles made in his own state. And of course, there are 5 around him because he had 5 sons. So that is an obvious. You saw this already when Bianca married the emperor. This is the portrait of her marriage. She has the Sempervivum because it means that with time also they will have children. They will be the offsprings of Sforzas and the emperor. But what is interesting is the portrait of the emperor. Because I thought, well, it's a marriage. There are 2 marriage portraits. There must be some link. Now, if you look at the undergarment, and you only see it a little bit on the shoulder, and you enlarge it, you see 2 quinces. So I thought, well, what kind of textile is that? Well, I found it. Now, you can't see it well, but here it is. It's got 3 quinces and 2 flowers from the Sempervivum. So the emperor was saying, Sempervivum met Zeit, the quince fragranza perdura, the perfume of youth will endure and with time will bear fruits. And he wore that garment, even in print, until 1505 when Bianca died. So Sforza was proud to be the wife of the emperor, but the emperor was proud to be the husband of Sforza. Of course, here we must say that Ludovico, her uncle, in order to have the emperor's diploma of his nobility, gave her such an outrageous dowry. It was really a payment. She got married in spring. The legal duke, the young boy, the young nephew, died in summer, and early September, Ludovico finally got what his father and his elder brother had never received, the imperial diploma for his nobility. So it was bought, and it was shown. And now I don't have much time, but we saw this in another textile, and here there is something else. You see that branch, scaly branch? So I went back to the plant. The Sempervivum has a scaly branch, but I've never seen the branch in the real plant, so I had to go to books. So I thought, well, that's funny, because that's a textile in the processional canopy given by Bishop Carlo Pallavicino to the Lodi Cathedral in 1495. But the Pallavicino was the most powerful family in Lombard. They were imperial nobility. They were much wealthier than the Sforzas. They had just looked down on the Sforzas all the time. But in 95, Ludovico had been an imperial duke for about 1 year, and it helped Carlo to become Bishop of Lodi. So Carlo has this canopy made with all the liturgical iconography, with his own coat of arms on it, but the textile holding the canopy is, in a way, a recognition of the Sforza. There are two of the Sforza's devices. So this to show you how everybody used these messages, these political messages, that of course they could read very readily. We have a hard time in these things we just found out in the past 2 years. Okay, then we get to the eldest son of Francesco, who never got the diploma from the emperor, who was a fashion fiend. He thought about nothing else. He wrote letters to his secretary every day, asking or telling him what to buy, which textiles, which color, for whom they were, and what kind of garments should be made. And then the garment arrived, and a week later it would say, no, it was not sewn properly. No, the lining wasn't right. Actually, this was one of the causes of his sad end. But anyway, here it is shown in the official portrait of his visit to his friend, Lorenzo il Magnifico. In 71, he went to Florence with his wife. His wife was Bona di Savoia, whose sister had married the king of France. So instead of wearing the Sforza's arms or Sforza's devices, he goes to Florence in a blue doublet embroidered with gold lilies. He wants Lorenzo to remember that he is related to the House of France through his great-grand-aunt, to his great-great-grandfather, and through his wife. She dresses the same. But what's important is that it goes with a retinue that you can read it. I mean, and that's not so unusual at this time. Important people will not travel light. But what is unusual, what is really unusual, is that everything was covered with silk textiles, down to the mules, down to the carts, to the wagons. He spent over 100,000 gold ducats. And that year, the whole year budget for the state of Milan was 500,000. So he spent 20%. Of course, he never paid. So he didn't spend them, he didn't have them. As a matter of fact, a year later in November, his secretary writes that it's such and such a a merchant would like to have his 10,380 ducats for having made such and such a thing. So he writes back, oh, do something about it. I don't want to worry about this. And how it went, in 76, he was murdered by a group of, well, it's not known, let's say by a group of noblemen, but his younger brother was probably involved. So in 76, that was the end of Galeazzo Maria, and Ludovico, who had wanted to be the Duke all his life, he started when he was 15 asking his mother if he could use this device or that device. Could he have the copyright on this device so that none of his brothers, 5 brothers, would use it? And the mother would write back, why do you want this one? Because the brush, with the brush, my father was going to clean up the whole state. I'm going to clean up the whole of Italy. He wanted to unite the whole country. It reminds us of. And I don't think now we have time, but what I was going to show to you, this is a fantastic textile, and why would they make it so complicated? And there's a history to this, but he had this made very probably as governor of Milan with his rightful duke, a young boy, kept away from the court in Vigevano, giving him all sorts of amenities, drugs, so he would just stay out of the way, and he died very young. And he is, this looks like an encyclopedia of devices, but it is not. There are only 6. And what's interesting is that they make up a sentence. The device of the radiating sun, which is the Visconti device, the illuminated prince. The device of the curb, a man who can hold a horse, is strong and wise. The device of the brush that he got, for which he had a copyright, his brothers could not use it. The device of the dove is at the meeting point of the net. You see there is a net formed by infinite knots, and the device of the dove is a bon droit that was made for the Visconti who married the French princess, who was very young. He was very old. There was a whole story. They thought they would never have children. If they did, they would not be legitimate. So Petrarch apparently made up this saying, well, if the Holy Ghost did it once, he could do it again. I'm making it funny, but it wasn't funny. And then the device of the X, the motto, all the harm that will be done to me will be given back. And the device of the buratto, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And the net is made of infinite knots, which was to remind people in the state that he had brought Bramante and Leonardo and the Predis and Zenale to Milan. And they were all using this symbol. It was not, they didn't invent it. I mean, it's in all cultures at all time, but they were suddenly very interested in using it a lot. And we see it, the Predis workshop, they did painting, but also embroidering. So, and that's the Pallavicino canopy. This is a very special velvet that was supposed to be either Spanish or Turkish, and we can prove it's Milanese. So the sentence is, your prince is not a duke yet, so your prince, who's lawfully your prince, who is an illuminated prince, who will clean up the state of all problems because he's wise and strong, because and he has brought art to this state. But, I put but myself in, but be careful. If anybody stands up to me, eye for eye, and I will reduce him to sawdust. And I think this is what he meant, because he had about 40 devices to choose from, but he chose these 6. And he was not the duke yet. And now we don't have time, but next time we have to stop.